I've been thinking a lot lately about the Vita. It all started because I wanted to start replaying Persona 4 Golden because I was getting excited for 5 Strikers, and I already played 5 Royal last year, so I wanted to go back even further. And after that, it seems like I've been just noticing more and more general chatter about the Vita in general this year. Between other people making videos, just even talking about the ones they have right now, to the PlayStation Vita store even getting updated recently, even though the system has been discontinued for almost 2 years, and being reminded of the fact that later this year it will be the system's 10-year anniversary. And just playing on mine again and thinking about it more and more, I kind of really want to see Sony take another stab at it. Obviously, this is not the highest thing on Sony's to-do list right now. I mean, first off, let's just make sure PS5s reliably show up in stores, and then we can move on to the next thing, which will probably end up being PSVR 2. And the Vita, despite its very avid fan base, of which I'm part of, it didn't exactly sell super great. Now, I don't really want to focus on why the Vita failed, because there's already a lot of great studies and retrospectives looking back at how that is. Maybe it's something I'll tackle later, but there's a whole lot of factors involved, including pricing, game library, Monster Hunter leaving for the 3DS, all kinds of stuff. What I want to focus on is what the Vita did well and how that can be pushed even further if they tried again. And I want to start by talking about something that's almost seemingly unrelated, the Switch Pro. The Switch Pro is something that people have been talking about constantly with the Nintendo Switch, wanting some kind of bigger, better, upgraded version, and it's not something I think Nintendo is honestly all that interested in doing. I don't think it's impossible that we'll get a Switch Pro sometime in the future, but it's not exactly something that Nintendo is trying to heavily revolutionize. They are more than happy with the system they have, with a larger focus on the game library. And a lot of things that people want to see, aside from improved performance and 4K dock support mode, is in general just a more premium feeling form factor for the system itself. Back when the handheld battle was the 3DS versus the Vita, one of the big things the Vita had in its corner was not only its higher resolution and better looking graphics and higher processing power, but was just the fact that it just feels like a more premium device. And this is largely rooted in the fact that I think of where priorities lie for Sony as a company. Nintendo is very much focused on innovation and weird ideas and trying cool stuff out that sometimes Sony might lightly try to copycat historically, but at the same time, Sony would focus on something that I would say is more of a focus on a more premium tech feeling. Whether that's the form factor, the size of the screen bezels, the feeling of the materials used to making the system, even in the fact that the original Vita launched with an OLED screen, though they did remove that in the later system. But the point I'm making is that Sony has a different emphasis when it comes to what kind of handheld they're interested in making, and I think there's a lot more renewed interest lately for something like that. I know I said I wasn't going to talk about why the Vita failed, but just one tangent on this is the fact that one of the reasons that a lot of people like to blame the Vita's failure on, including Sony themselves, is the fact that at the time, the mobile market was a big deal. There was this very prevailing thought and feeling that handheld gaming was now going to be completely obsolete because everyone owns a smartphone, and that's much better than having to buy a whole separate dedicated handheld. And the Switch has kind of disproved that now. Yeah, sure, the Switch can also be docked, and that's something a lot of people like, but ultimately it's also renewed this interest, I think, in a lot of people of showing what a dedicated handheld can offer that a cell phone doesn't necessarily have. For instance, a form factor built around the idea of being used for gaming, having built-in controls, and offering a larger screen than most current phones have, even though some of them are getting pretty ridiculously large. Now, form factor and having a very shiny system is all well and good, but obviously the main thing we really want to focus on is the idea of, if Sony made another handheld, what would it offer to the gaming space as far as games go? And there's really 3 main things the original Vita offered that could be heavily improved upon. First off, first-party games. Not actually the Vita's biggest strength. There were some good titles on the Vita. I've got a couple personal favorites that I really like, but after some of those didn't do quite as well, there was a very heavy shift in focus instead on indie games and JRPGs, which personally actually works out great for me because I love JRPGs, but it's not exactly a giant selling point for the entire Western audience. And something that has changed since the original Vita's launch is the success of the PS4 and the opening success of the PS5. Back when the Vita came out during the time of the PS3, things were a little more even as far as console manufacturers go. PlayStation 3 and 360 were very neck and neck, and that perception did begin to change very quickly at the launch of PS4 and Xbox One due to some very bad marketing decisions on Microsoft's part at the time, but ultimately there's been a much larger audience now of people dedicated to PlayStation as a platform, and one of the big selling points of the PS4 itself was its first-party titles. PlayStation has come a long way in terms of IPs over the last 7 years, with the release of PlayStation All-Stars asking the question, who are the All-Stars that we care about, to now having a ton of games, and really one of the biggest selling factors of PlayStation being their first-party library and developers. So having that teamed up with the renewed interest in handhelds thanks to the Nintendo Switch could work out pretty well. Next up, let's talk about backwards compatibility, because to be completely honest, one of the major reasons why I use the PS Vita is not to play any Vita games at all, actually. The vast majority of my time on the system has really been spent playing PlayStation 1 classics that were made available digitally for the system, as well as some great PSP games that I don't necessarily want to break out a PSP for and benefit from the larger screen size of the Vita. The system is an amazing gateway to some of PlayStation's best classic titles, infinitely more so in fact than buying a PlayStation Classic itself. And the thing is, as good as it was for playing some of these games, honestly, things could be a lot better. There are numerous PS1 classics that were made available on the PS3 that did not reach the Vita for one reason or another, unless you did some very fancy workarounds. Obviously, there's also the modding option, which gave way more access to lots of titles that normally wouldn't be on the Vita. But imagine if PlayStation took this concept of which classical games are available on the system and adding even more to a proper digital library. A handheld Sony device that not only allows you to play classic games from the PSP and the Vita and the original PlayStation, but also having a digital catalog of PS2 titles and maybe even tapping into some ports of stuff from the PS3. I mean, look at how often Nintendo is able to dig up some big hit games from the SNES and the NES that people will buy again and again, and realize the fact that the PS2 is, to this day, still the top-selling system ever. There is so much untapped nostalgia for that system's library, outside of a handful of occasional HD remakes, that could be given access again in handheld form, which would be great. One of the most demanded features for a lot of people with the PS5 is having a more robust form of backwards compatibility, because as it stands right now, it's just the PS4. And there's all kinds of logistical reasons for why this wouldn't work, especially for the PS3, and Sony has not been shy about the fact that they don't necessarily see the appeal in letting people play older games. The handheld is the perfect place for these things to get new life, because you're able to capitalize on something that, sure, may not look great on a modern big screen TV, but ages really well when you shrink it down to being on just a little portable handheld, and you have the novelty of replaying some of your favorite classical titles on the go. And then there's the concept of remote play. One of the really cool features that was added to the Vita post-launch when the PS4 released was the fact that you could remotely play your PS4 on the Vita, as long as you were in the same household connected to the same Wi-Fi, so you could play it in a different room. It was a nifty feature back then, but obviously we've hit a point now where there are way cooler versions of this that you can do, including the ability to play your PS5 remotely using your phone over Wi-Fi in a completely different location. Something that I've been revisiting in my head a lot is the old rumors of Xbox and Nintendo becoming best friends. Back when Ori and Cuphead were announced as coming to the Switch, people were beginning to have all kinds of additional hopes and theories and rumors that Xbox and Nintendo were going to have this really deep partnership where the Switch would offer Xbox Game Pass and xCloud support, so you could remotely play Xbox games on your Switch. Because while being able to play games on your phone is cool, having an actual dedicated handheld with onboard controls and a larger screen is even cooler. And so imagine if Sony had their own first-party option that enabled this kind of compatibility. In fact, it would even convert Sony into basically having their own version of the Nintendo Switch. One that would be more expensive, because you'd be buying two separate systems instead of one, but at the trade of having PS5 level graphics not only on your PS5, but also being streamed to your handheld. I honestly don't think Sony is very interested in the idea of making a handheld right now. Between how the Vita performed, leaving a bad taste in their mouth, and the current market being cornered by the Nintendo Switch and PlayStation already having a lot of great luck with their focus on home consoles, it's just not a thing I think they're going to dive into right now. But looking back at the Vita, now that it's almost 10 years old and has been discontinued for almost 2 years once we hit March, and thinking of what really could have been with it and what could happen if it was executed just right with the new system, really makes me wish they would reconsider. I guess what I'm really getting at here is everyone watching this video who agrees with me, we should all just start complaining to Sony a lot more often, and maybe they'll actually do it. I don't know. I want it. Real bad.